Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. This podcast is for and about women of colour and our relationship with nature. Hosted by me, Sheree Mack. The Earth, Sea, Love podcast is committed to exploring the experiences of women of colour with Mother Nature. We want to provide spaces where the hidden voices in the environmental and conservation conversations can explore their relationship with the natural world. Inspired by our time spent outdoors, we amplify the voices of women of colour, our stories, our conversations, interviews, photography, writing, and artwork. We'll be exploring our legacies, histories, and memories which have had an influence and effect upon how we perceive ourselves within the natural world and within the environmental and climate justice movements. Welcome to the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. The Earth, Sea, Love podcast has been made possible by the funding from National Lottery Heritage Fund. Thank you. Hi. Welcome to another episode of the Earth, Sea, Love podcast. And this is the second episode this week. Yay! And this is a really good episode with the lovely Sarah Hussain. Well, let's just say Sarah touches upon, because I am making no apologies for allowing Sarah to talk, to share her story. In this episode, my voice is minimal because Sarah has a lot to share. She has so much wisdom, knowledge, and life's experiences to share that it was such an inspiration to be able to sit down with her and just listen and be educated. So also, this was recorded during Ramadan, so I really appreciated Sarah taking the time and the energy to share on this episode. Now living in Huddersfield, but was born in Doncaster. She's an educator and a writer, and we touch upon her writing, we touch upon her education and how she's doing a PhD at the moment around ecological degradation. And that's something that is so pertinent now, mid-July, and we've seen the news. West USA heat waves, extreme records of high temperatures. This has been caused by human activities, human exploitation, and human interference really with the natural cycle of this earth. And anyone who's out there denying that this heat wave, which has scorched the Pacific Northwest, which is killing thousands of different species of marine wildlife and human beings. They need their head testing if they're still saying that this is a con, that there isn't climate change, climate crisis. Let Sarah talk, because Sarah touches upon it, how we should be listening to women of colour around the world who have been in close relationship with the earth, who have been working in harmony with the earth, because here are the answers, here are the solutions to this present climate crisis. That's what climate justice is. It's recognizing that mostly Western activity, Western exploitation, Western colonialization has caused the problems that we are in now in the Western world, but we do know that the global South has been feeling the repercussions of our actions, our ancestors' actions for decades, and no one's been listening to them or helping. So we touch upon that because this is part of Sarah's research, but how she's been looking historically within the social activism of women of colour in the Himalayas, in India, in South Asia, and how they have been tree huggers for so long and have just been written out of history. So it's really good to hear Sarah talk about that and the idea of these lack of women's voices in the ecological, scientific, forestry data. And why it's important to hear Sarah's voice is because she's actually changing the narrative. The stereotype out there about South Asian women are that they're subservient, they're silent, domesticated, all those stereotypes that we are fed through literature, through the mainstream of what and how South Asian women are. But really it's a myth, it's a construct, because when you hear Sarah speak, she does not fit that stereotype. She is a passionate, intelligent, articulate, big-hearted woman of colour. And it was such a pleasure to sit down with her and learn. So I bring this episode to you, and please, let's just open your hearts and open your ears to the message that is in there, and how we can all become change makers. Sarah does mention that idea of we are the change makers by taking a seat at the table. That just resonates so much with me when I'm thinking of how long I stood on the sidelines and criticized organizations, mainly white-dominated organizations, for keeping all the power, not listening to our voices of other people, other communities that do not look like them, and then getting opportunities to sit at the table, and then maybe being full of fear, maybe being full of the idea of failing or saying the wrong thing, and then saying, oh no, sorry, I don't want to sit at the table, I don't want to have those conversations with you. And that's not the case now, but I know I've done that in the past, and I know the difference between then and now. And it's something that Sarah does mention, is that idea of us being comfortable in our own skin. Us as people of colour being comfortable in our own skin to the point that we no longer feel the need or fulfill that need of explaining or demonstrating or bending over backwards trying to convince, persuade white people that we are worthy, that we are human beings. Yeah, because for me personally, through the experiences that I've been through, I'm more than comfortable in my own skin, and more than comfortable in allowing others to be confused or have whatever opinions they want of me. I do not control or want to control or even have any influence over how anyone else sees or perceives me, because I'm all right with how I see myself. I'm all right. And there's power in that. And listening back to this episode with Sarah, editing it, it's the case of her wisdom and her shining bright light has come back to inspire me again, and has reminded me that I'm all right. I'm more than all right. And I hope that through listening to this episode that you can take away that message for yourself and hold that close to your heart for yourself. And then hopefully once you've got that for yourself, you can start emitting it towards others. And, just sharing that love, shining that light of love. Yeah. Anyway, enough from me. And let's get into this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now. Welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of the Earthsea Love podcast, and especially for being here during Ramadan. So thank you kindly. And how are you?
Yeah, I'm well. Thank you for having me. I'm not going to lie, it's a little bit tiring after sunrise because I find it hard to fall back to sleep. So I'm a little tired, but it's okay. It's all part of the process.
Oh, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. And I've been so looking forward to speaking to you because I haven't seen you in a while. I haven't spoken to you a while. So it's lovely to check back in with you and to see how you are. So what we usually start off with is just situating ourselves. Our listeners want to know where you are in the world, and if you can see anything of nature outside your window this bright morning.
I can indeed. I'm from Huddersfield, so and I live in a townhouse, and on the bottom floor, just outside my patio windows, there are lots of trees. Yesterday I sat outside doing some writing, and I can hear the birds. We've recently planted peppers and tomatoes, so I feel I'm really lucky to be surrounded by mostly the beautiful trees.
Yeah, sounds so beautiful, and I do envy you that outdoor space, as I do live on a ground floor flat, but we don't have our own space outside, so that's why the sea about 5 minutes away is, I would say, my my favorite spot in nature. And it's interesting because you said that you were outside yesterday writing, and that is something that I love about this podcast. I get to know people that little bit better and that little bit more intimately. And when you sent over your bio, you had this long list of publications that you have penned. So just tell us a little bit about yourself. You say you're an educator and an author. Do you want to expand a little bit on that? What do you educate? What do you teach? And what do you write about?
Well, my first passion has always been teaching. I began teaching about 15 years ago. It's probably a bit longer, and I've worked in all sectors. So I started off working in the primary sector. Then I moved to high school. Then I started moving. Then I moved to college. I taught in Kirklees College, ESOL, English to speakers of other languages, and that's actually when I was sort of first really inspired to write my novella, Escape from Syria. I used to teach sometimes migrants, people who had fled from war-torn countries. And one day we were sat in the classroom and they were telling me about how some of them had to, come on lorries, sleep on bin liners. And when they arrived to the UK, unfortunately, sometimes they'd be met with some forms of hostility when they went to the job centre, as though, they were really, they were coming here because they kind of, it was challenged, the idea that why were they coming here, but really they were coming here because they had no choice. A lot of these folk were even middle class, had really good jobs. So when I was listening to them, I really believe in connecting with my students. It really affected me. I wanted to do something. So I thought, if I can capture their story, capture their voices, the world might be able to understand. So that was what led me to write the first novella. I'd always been writing because I did a BA honours in arts of literature. I've got an English degree, and I'd always sort of dabbled in writing. But I think at that point it was more the social justice side of the story that the people's voice that I wanted to really bring out through that, which led me then to, I was going to do an education master's, but then I decided to do a creative writing master's because I wanted to develop my writing style and the technique. So then that led me to then work towards writing a short story collection. So the short story collection is a series of short stories. It's called Sit Up, Stand Up, Speak Up. When my students are in a classroom, I usually tell them, if you have something to say, I always say sit up, and sometimes I ask them to stand up. And I just thought it was a powerful way to have each protagonist to actually stand up for what they believe in. So the first one is set in colonized India in Kerala, and about a young girl. And the second one is called Predator versus Prey. And it's kind of a metaphor of what happens between the viceroy and the servant maid girl. And then it's a range of stories. I won't go into all of them. And then after that, I've just been sort of, as well as teaching, after I left, I worked at a training provider for a while and became a manager. I used to manage a traineeship program, but eventually I moved on to teach academic English at the University of Huddersfield, which is what I really love. I love the idea of working in an international environment because I'm meeting people from different nationalities. So I might have one year there was 45 different nationalities, and I really feel that when you work with people from around the world, your unconscious bias is knocked slowly because you're having an opportunity to really get to know these people from all around the world, and it's just amazing. So while I've been working there, and I've also kind of been engaging with the English and Creative Writing Department at the University of Huddersfield. So I applied for a competition. I entered a competition. They were launching an anthology called Grist. They wanted to celebrate protest. So I decided to enter a story called You'll Be Free and One Day, My Dearest India, informed by the life of Bikija Karma, who was actually an Asian suffragette. And for me, it was just really important to, again, bring that voice, which I feel there's been a lack of representation in in voice of women of color. I feel in literature, in positive voice, the positive aspects of what women of color have achieved. So I wanted to bring that out, and thankfully I made it into the finalists, and it was the stories included in the anthology. I've also International Women's Day, there was a Miss Shakespeare competition. And I entered that as well, and I was commissioned to do some research, oral history research. So what happened was I decided to interview women, the first generation women who first migrated, and they worked in factories. And I wrote this story called a monologue called Hope, about a woman. It was quite an emotional story about when she first arrives and how she stood at the top of the escalators in her clothes, and she has all the eyes are transfixed on her, and how she sort of feels like an alien, and how she's having to again work indoors rather than working outside, because a lot of women who kind of arrived were kind of planting outside and were cooking outside with their pots and pans, and then all of a sudden to have packed spices from the shop. So I kind of captured this experience of this woman from the interviews in this monologue, and when it was performed on International Women's Day, it was really profound, and I really it was amazing to hear someone kind of like she was a trained actress from Bradford who performed it, and I thought it was wonderful. So yeah, that's kind of been my writing journey. For a few years now, I'm working on a PhD. I'm looking at ecological degradation in the Himalayan region from the post-colonial eco-feminist perspective. So to unpack that, I'm looking at how the women's contribution, the women's forestry contribution, has been really undermined. So what happened is the English traders, they set foot in the Himalayan region, and what they did was they chopped down the trees in order to transport that over to England. And when they did that, the land was destroyed. It led to major landslides, but also it deprived the women of fuel and fodder, because these women, they relied upon the natural land. Eventually, these women, they started to protest in non-violent form of activism, and they went on what you call satyagraha, which is what Gandhi has been celebrated for. But my research is really looking at the women's contribution, because I feel in the non-violent struggle and activism, a lot of the men have been, we talk about a lot of the men, our kind of history is focused on civil rights movements, we focus a lot on the men. So my researchers really looking at these women, because these women were active even before a lot of the men were kind of doing marches, doing treks. These women, later on then in 1970, the Chipko movement, the women trekked all across different regions, and they embraced the trees, they hugged the trees. So when the axemen raised their axes, they said, look, we will not raise our hands in violence, but the trees provide for us, and we will not allow you to chop them down. And this was kind of informed by a lady right back in Rajasthan, a lady called Amrita Devi. She basically she gave her life for the trees, because a man, a prince, wanted to chop down the trees to extend his fort, and she said, we will not raise our hands in violence, but we will not allow you to chop down the trees. And her and her 3 daughters, they were killed, and all the rest of the 300 Bishnoi villages. So that's where the kind of, right back to 1713 AD, that's where the idea of this connection to the natural earth began. And I've been researching, looking at the broadleaf tree. So what happened was the English traders replaced the trees with pine trees, because it was better for them to export to England. But actually, what's interesting is these women had very important ecological insight. So the broadleaf tree, such as the banj, was important to that region. So regeneration was difficult, because they were actually, because people assume that you can just plant trees, afforestation can happen naturally, but actually in certain regions, ecologically appropriate trees are relevant for certain regions in order for them to thrive. What's interesting is when I was young, you'd hear about a flood in South Asia, and a lot of people would just assume that it's a natural disaster, but actually it's not a natural disaster. It's due to our interference with the natural land, because those broadleaves, they provide a moisture to the land, a leaf mold deposit. And it's essential for that land to have trees, especially because they have the monsoon season as well. So I've been looking at the lack of representation in the women's ecological scientific forestry voice, because what happened was, after the industrialization, is the men, they started to portray the woman, which it happens with women of color generally, but my research is looking at the hill women of the Himalayas. As they became the tree huggers, so they were portrayed as savage and backward. And the idea of modern science, because it was linked with economic development, so people didn't want to really hear these women's voices. What they wanted to do was make money. These trees are making money, so why should we listen? So they were kind of mocked and undermined. The reason that I feel this is relevant today is because we are in, if you look at the climate problem today and you look at environmental degradation, if we actually just sit back and look at how these women of these colonized lands, if we look at indigenous women from Asia and Africa, these women had knowledge. They were connecting with the natural earth in a way that they would use the natural earth in a way that it would allow it to regenerate, and they weren't exploiting it. And I think we need to look back at the ways these women lived in order for us to encourage a sustainable future for us now. So it's been really interesting, because for me, when I look at, I'd like to produce something creative out of it. And when I look at the literature, when I was young, basically I would see most of the novels which were picked up by publishers would portray South Asian women as oppressed, and the victimhood role was often really portrayed. Even if you look right back to the Victorian feminist literature, they would use their literature to portray the Indian woman, the savior. They wanted to be the savior of this woman. So she was portrayed as a victim right from the beginning, even by the Victorian feminist sister. She was portraying her Indian sister as, this woman who needs saving. So what happened was, eventually this kind of representation has become predominant. So every book such as Brick Lane, which kind of most of the books kind of show this woman who she can only kind of acquire freedom in the West if she adopts Western values. But I'd like to challenge this, because actually that's not true, because while the women were being accused of witchcraft here, the women in those regions were actually working for themselves. They weren't homebound. They were actually out there, connecting with the natural earth, collecting fuel and fodder, going out, gathering food for themselves and their families, and as well as protecting the natural earth. When I was young, I remember watching East is East. And again, it was just the idea of forced marriages and this representation of this woman of not having a voice. But there were women, even far back in as far back as the 1970s, before that, who were active and they were social activists then. And I think that's quite amazing. So I want to be able to produce a piece of literature that will really create a positive representation of these women. And I want for young women of color, young women to see that there are, positive role models out there, and that they don't. When I was young, I didn't see that, and it was had quite a negative impact, because even if you try, I used to feel that when I tried to conform to Western values and to being, I was never really accepted. I experienced a great deal of racial discrimination at school. I was the only South Asian girl, and although I'm light skinned, they used to say to me that, oh, you're called Sarah and you're light, so you're one of us. And they used to call me, Paki, and I had my headscarf pulled off my head, and I think that really impacted me. I think really that's where my journey of seeking social justice came from, because I think what happened is those microaggressions and those experiences, then they kind of stay with you. And while you're young and you can't really put names to those experiences, then you grow up and you think, well, I remember being young and I wanting to join in with my friends. They was dancing to steps, and they turned around, and when I joined in, they started laughing at me, like as if to say, you're a Paki, you can't dance with us. And I remember it hit me hard that day that, well, no matter what I do, I'm kind of never going to be accepted. So there was a talent show, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna stick to my stick to my roots and my heritage. So I sang. There's a song that the people sang to Prophet Muhammad when he come to Medina, called it's about they kind of celebrate him coming, Tala al Badru Alayna. So I got up on stage predominantly, it's in Doncaster, in a school. I sometimes, when I reflect, I can't believe I did it, because I must have been brave at that age in year 7 to get up on stage. And I just sang that song, and I actually won the talent show. And I think from a young age, I realized that, you know what, it's okay for me to be in tune with my heritage, that no matter what I do, I'm not going to fit in there. So there was kind of a deep connection that I felt, even though I'm third generation. So I don't feel like I had a direct connection, because my mum, my parents were born in England, so I don't think they had because when I compare it to some people who I know who are second generation and their parents are direct, who have come from, for example, South Asia, Pakistan, they have got kind of more of a connection. But for me, it was because I was third generation. My parents were born here. There was no kind of link. My grandparents were even living in England, so I had no link and no way of kind of connecting with that side. So what happened was, I really feel that through postgraduate study, I was able to really understand British South Asian connections. But because before that, in school, again, there was no literature, no books, there was no way for me to understand. So you feel, I've kind of, my whole life have felt like a second-class citizen, even though I'm British born, and I've kind of felt a little bit like rejected from my birth country. And I can't generalize and say that every experience has been like that. I've met some wonderful people, but a lot have been like that, and I feel like I shouldn't have to kind of downplay that to make few people feel better, because I often feel we have to do that, and sometimes people of color too, because you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, you kind of downplay your experience. But it's unfair, because this is my experience. I cannot hide away from that experience, because it has informed my whole life, and I think that's informed my choices for my children, really, because even my daughter, now I feel that I don't want her to ever feel the way I felt. So when she's going to a school now where she's seeing a range of people from different backgrounds, she's happy, and I feel she's learning a lot more, and she's a lot more informed. So I think those experiences when I was younger really informed my journey. Then what happened was, when I moved to Huddersfield when I was about 16, and it was just it was amazing, because Huddersfield is a very different place to Doncaster. And I just met some wonderful people, and I just felt a lot more of a sense of belonging, because there was kind of a strong community here. And I felt the teachers were more informed. I mean, I remember being a young girl in my school in Doncaster, and the only ever piece of literature that was kind of presented to me was Presents from My Aunt in Pakistan by Maniza Alvi. And I remember when the teacher read it out, everybody just kind of stopped and sat staring at me. Even the teacher just kind of paused for a second. I remember just feeling like an alien in the classroom. And I think maybe that's why I wanted to become an educator so badly, because I felt like that is not how I would, I would teach. And I think for me, I think I really, really ensure that I kind of plan, and my resources are kind of planned in order to meet the needs of every individual learner. So if I've got someone from Nigeria, or someone from UAE, or if I've got someone from India, I'll make sure that everybody in my class, they are, the resources are made so that everybody feels a sense of belonging. It's always such a wonderful environment when because of the pandemic, because we've been at home. I don't think the online experience is quite the same, because I feel when I'm in the classroom and when we sat there, there's just this, it's just such an amazing learning experience, because as well as them learning from me in terms of academia, but I feel like I learn from them because they bring their whole lived experiences to the classroom as well. So it's just a really wonderful experience. And I think that's why I probably wanted to become an educator, because I said, you know what, there's a way of doing it. And that it's making students, like Maslow talks about the hierarchy of needs, making sure students feel comfortable and safe before you can even begin learning. If you're making someone feel awkward, they're not going to want to learn. But I think with the writing, I think for me, writing is just a form of expression. But this year I've found it a little bit more challenging, because when I first started writing, it was more, I'm just expressing myself. But when I did my master's, I realized that there were a set of rules and technical things like showing and telling and point of view, and using the correct tense. And at the beginning, I found it a bit frustrating, because I just wanted to be free with it. But why should I have to follow a set of rules, and this is how you write? But I've realized actually those rules it's not rules, it's just the way I trained to become a teacher, and the way you train to do something, in the same way you're training to write. So these are not rules, it's just training to become. So recently I've just been reading Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie's, and he's just amazing. He's writing the metaphors and the writing style. So I've been I've been reading like lots of literature and looking at the different writing style. And I realized that, for example, when I'm working on my exegesis and I'm just reading and I'm paraphrasing and direct quotations, and I find it easy. But when I'm writing, I feel like I'm having to edit at sentence level, at word level. It could be that one word in the paragraph changes the whole setting, or it has an impact on the writing as a whole. So I feel like I've really developed, and it's been a challenge. But I think it's worth it. It's for me, life is about developing and just getting better. And
awesome, Sarah. I mean, you're doing my job for me. I just asked you the one question, but you've told us such a rich array of stories, your stories, other people's stories. And when I say stories, I don't mean that they're made up in that sense. I mean, it's like the narratives. These are what make us tick as human beings. And you've just shared such an array. And so, we've traveled with you as well to different countries and different time zones. So thank you for that open and an honest response. And I'm sitting here and I'm nodding along with a lot of the things that you've touched upon here. And I'm not going to unpick it now, because I'll do that when I introduce this episode, because this is an episode that's just gonna run I'm not going to be interjecting. I usually get involved here, but I think it's really important that your voice is out there crystal clear. And that's why I'm also going to say, I'm going to invite you back, and then because we're having creative sessions on the podcast when we've got women of color writers sharing their creative output. And what you said there about changing the narrative about the South Asian woman, I think we need to have that voice here as well. We've got you as the real person, but then that imaginary South Asian woman who challenges the stereotypes that we are fed constantly, I think would be a powerful episode to have. So thank you for bringing that up. And I've just got a few other questions, because we met through the research that was carried out by CPRE, which was a participant-led project, which was looking at diversity, or why there wasn't the lack of diversity within the English countryside. We all had to go off and talk to our people in our own little small part of the world, and then come back as a group and share these stories, share this research, and then work out ways to disseminate it. And what I want to touch upon is that you actually wrote an article from your research. Do you want to speak about that, which is on the CPRE website, which I will link to their blog about it? But what came out from your research that you actually shared in this article?
I think being part of this project was, I think it was really important for me, because as soon as we began the research project, we were looking at barriers to accessing nature. I knew straight away that I wanted to interview women of color, because I always feel that as women of color, we're always stereotyped, and I sometimes just feel that no one pays attention to our voice. I've recently been quite I'm just going off tangent, but just to make the point that I just feel like when women of color are kind of given a voice, they're kind of attacked, and recently in the media we've seen it with quite a few women who were in politics, and I thought, if that's going to happen, I feel like we have to take ownership of our own voices, because if people are going to misrepresent our voices, then we need women of color who are listening to each other. So this was my opportunity to go out there and interview a range of women and bring their voice to the table. And it was amazing, because I had, I've got a Caribbean friend who I interviewed. I've got a friend. There was a range of women from a few different backgrounds. And what I asked, it was a very open conversation about how they feel about accessing nature. And what was interesting was a lot of the experiences were very similar, in that what really stood out to me was that they expressed this idea of really having to consider where they're going and the thought process that goes into choosing where they would like to go for a walk, for example. I call it the short risk assessment. And I which is interesting, because I do that with my students, but I feel like I have to do this risk assessment all the time when I'm taking my children somewhere. Is it going to be okay to go there? Because will people be okay with my headscarf? So what happened was, a lot of these women were talking about this, and about how they prefer to go to a local park rather than out to the countryside. And it was really saddening, because I was speaking to some first generation people who had arrived to this country, who had lived actually out in the open, in the landscape where they were just surrounded by animals and fields, and then they'd come here to be in this little, they call it, one of the women, she called the house like a little box where she felt trapped with the brick walls. And she said, I had no choice. I couldn't go anywhere because I didn't know where to go. I didn't know the language, and I just had to work and get on with it. And I just, from the research, I realized that there hadn't really been, anything in place to really help these women kind of draw them out of because I've heard the counter argument that the people of color, their communities, they stick in their own communities and don't integrate. But I think that's unfair, because in my experience of when you've gone out, and what a lot of the women said is that when you're greeted with cold hard stares, like, what are you doing here, it can really put you off. when you go somewhere, you want to feel at ease. And also, I think the women picked up on the fact that there were no facilities. So sometimes, in terms of food, I mean, not everybody eats bacon and not everybody eats certain foods. And I think that was certainly something what I picked up on. And what was also interesting, when I talk about the dress, I find the dress code, because I feel that quite often the media represents the Muslim woman with her black veil as, a depressive black veiled woman, but actually, obviously, the women across the world globally, not all Muslim women wear a headscarf, and actually, everybody's got their own culture and the way they want to dress modestly. What I'd found, particularly in England, in Yorkshire, was that one of the women, she said to me that I feel like I have to change my scarf and put it and wear it in a turban, westernized turban style, in order to make people be more comfortable. I might wear like a skirt and I might wear English clothes. And she says you'd be surprised that when, in comparison to when I wear my native dress, just people are a lot more at ease. And subconsciously, I do that too. I think about the color. If I'm going to wear black might make people feel uncomfortable. So you know what? Let me wear something more bright, because bright, they won't feel it. But it's sad that we have to feel like that, because this is just a natural place. So, if you just want to go on a walk to the natural land, you shouldn't really have to worry about these things. But I think these are the things that some people take for granted. And I know recently, I feel like people have become very kind of defensive when people talk about race and gender. And I kind of think that it's not really, people don't need to be defensive. It's an open conversation, and it's just that people are kind of finding the confidence to talk a little bit more about their experiences, because we want change. And I think rather than being translated as we're not attacking anyone. When you talk about experiences and not attack, it's just talking openly about how we can improve the situation and how we can make the situation better, and how we need to be allies for one another and support one another to move forward. But this project, the article, I think, was really a good way to bring out these women's voices, and I was really happy with it. And it was nice to be able to say, well, I went back to the women, and obviously, as well as interviewing them, to go back and say, well, this is what I wrote, and they were happy that their voices were out there.
And I'm so pleased that you got to write that article too, because I don't know about you, but many of the times that I do get involved with my community and maybe tasked from a white establishment or a white organization, I sometimes feel that we're going into our community and just taking their voices. So then to come back and show this is where your story has gone for now, this is just the beginning, and to show them that we're not just taking, that we're having this conversation and a dialogue, and that their input is valuable, and it's also getting out there and being amplified. And I think that's why I did love the writing, but I also recognize that it was also a gateway to be opening up, that more voices can be heard. And I do take on board what you're saying about people being defensive. And I think it is because, like, when we do share our stories, and that's what we're doing, that's all we're doing, sharing our stories and experience, they get on the defensive because it pricks their conscience. They are actually able to feel something and recognize something, and it's something that they can't actually handle or describe or check themselves about, because it's not a practice that is mainstream, and it's not something that they've probably had to do before. So being on the defensive is the natural way of going to begin with, and we accept that, but then keep listening, keep having that dialogue. And that just comes to my next point, because we're billed, aren't we, to be talking to the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs next week, aren't we?
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure what I'm going to be saying. I probably need some help from you, Sarah, because you are such a shining light here. You are so inspiring me. And I'm interested, like, you're going to be sitting down with him, obviously virtually. And the brief I've been told is that, we're just going to talk and he's going to listen. So have you thought about what you're going to be saying to him? As you're saying, barriers to accessing the countryside.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I've been more excited about this interview today. That's been kind of at the back of my mind. Like the first thing was, because we've been planning this for a while, and I've been looking forward to it because, for me, human connection is important, and speaking to people who really understand you, it's really good for your soul. Yeah. And as I'm getting older, it's really important to me to because before I used to feel like I had the weight of the world, in that I used to feel like I had to convince the ignorant to not be ignorant. But I found that in doing that, it's been draining me. So what I've been reading and actually been listening to the audio of why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, the book. And what she says is really important, because what she says is that she put the first Facebook post out, and she just said she was tired of explaining. So I don't really, I feel like I don't really want to feel like should next week come that it's a explaining. Yes, it's an opportunity. I feel like it's an opportunity to share our experience. That's fine, but I'm not going to kind of feel like have high expectations in that something amazing change is going to happen because of the gentleman. For me, I feel like we are the game changers, because by taking a seat at the table, we're making the change. So I realized that when I was younger, when I've expected people to change or do something, they've not changed it. It's been me who's had to move forward and do the work in order to make my surroundings better. So I see this as an opportunity. It's come because I sometimes think, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Yes Man, or Jim Carrey's Yes Man. When you say yes, sometimes saying yes can just be an opportunity. But I'm just keeping my expectations from that meeting balanced, and not getting to overly enthusiastic about the outcome, basically.
Yeah, and I love that attitude, and I concur with what you're saying. It is an opportunity to share our experiences. Yeah, I look forward to sitting at the table with you, Sarah, more than the Secretary of State, because sitting at the table with you is an example. You lift us up, and you remind us, because that has a brilliant reminder for me. Yeah, I don't have to keep explaining myself, or I don't have to keep trying to convince you of my humanity. Yeah. You know it. So thank you for that, because I think in my frustration, I do get on at that point that, right, okay, well, I have to do this, and I need to stress this, that you need to, and yeah, it does wear you thin and wear you out. And the black fatigue is out there. It's real. It's not just another buzzword that we're putting out. But thank you for that word, because I've been feeling it, but I didn't know what it was. But now I do know. I'm just tired, so tired of the shit.
Do you know what happened? Yeah. I did a talk on International Women's Day a few years ago, and this young girl, she said to me, how can I explain to people about my headscarf, and how can I make them feel good? And I said to her, you don't have to. I said, why is the responsibility on you to make the white Indigenous counterpart or white counterpart feel comfortable? At the end of the day, you wear your headscarf, and that's fine. You don't need to explain. And she said, oh my gosh, like I've never looked at it like that. But I think we hold a lot of that responsibility on our shoulders, but it shouldn't be our responsibility. If somebody doesn't want to understand, then that's on them. There's nothing we can do about that. But we have to be comfortable in our own skin, and for other people to actually respect us, we have to be comfortable in our own skin. So I've learned that over the years.
Yes, and I'm with you. I'm with you on that, you know, with that maturity and with those years. And there's so much power in that to us as individuals, of letting go, feeling that we have to explain to others, and also for us to become more comfortable in our own skins. And that is because we're not given that learning or information from outside. It has to come from within. And you mentioned the soul, and that is where we need to peel back the layers of the experiences, the racism, the education, the white supremacy culture, to get to that soul within, which is so beautiful and such a light. And then once we've tapped into it that ourselves, we can go around the world, society, shining our little light, because we're okay with that. We're more than okay with that. We love that, man. We love that. And you're such a light, and thank you for being on this podcast, Sarah. And I just want to finish. We started with what can you see of nature outside your door? And you've got your patio, and you've been out and you've got the trees. But do you have a favorite spot in nature that you go to regularly to fill up your pot, to feed your soul?
Do you know, it is just outside my my bottom floor here outside here. I sit here and I read, and it's just secluded, and I just love it. I really, I'm a private person who really, because if I go, as I said, there are certain apprehensions of going to certain places, and which I still feel need to be sort of broken down. So I don't really go too far out. And if I go to the park, I feel that I don't get my privacy. So like, I'm just sat here now, and there's a little robin that's just flew by my window. I like it. I think I'm very privileged to have this back garden and to have this space. I'm very lucky, and I see it as a blessing, so I make the most of it. So yeah, I have some little chairs all around there, and I love to just sit there on my own quietly, sometimes with some music playing, sometimes with a book, and just to watch the birds, and I love it, just that peacefulness.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Sarah. It has been a gift. It has been my blessing for the day. I've got a busy day of meetings and writings, but this has really set me up to be smiling for the rest of my day. So thank you. Thank you for bringing your presence to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.